Today on CityCast Madison. The City of Madison's police just wrapped their 90-day police body cam pilot on the north side yesterday. The aim for that pilot was to test the feasibility of body cams for the full force. Did you know that back in March, shortly before that pilot launched, the state passed a law that made access to those kinds of public records more expensive? Tone Madison recently did a deep dive on the law, saying it stands to undermine the transparency argument for equipping the city's police with body cameras. CityCast Madison's Hayley Sperling sat down with the publisher of Tone Madison, Scott Gordon, who wrote that piece, to ask about the changes to accessing our public records. It's Monday, July 15th. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about.
Scott Gordon, thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. You actually just came out with this big article talking about a new law related to Wisconsin's open records policy. And before diving too deep into this conversation, I did just kind of want to start with some of the basics. So, as basically as we can get, what counts as a public record?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And the general answer to that is any document produced by the government at local, state, or federal levels that is subject to public review that would be, appropriate to release to the public. And that's, probably most things that the government produces, whether those are printed documents or audio material, video material, spreadsheets of data, text messages on official devices, things like that. And for the most part, if the government decides that something is not appropriate for public release, it has to have a good reason, to do so, like dealing with national security or whatever, for instance. Like there has to be some good kind of compelling reason, at least ostensibly, for the government to say, like, no, we're not going to release this document, or we're going to release it with heavy redactions or whatever, as the case may be.
So like nuclear codes, not public records. Text messages and emails definitely can be requested, yeah?
Texting people the nuclear codes would be a bit more of a gray area, I guess.
Thankfully, we don't have to deal with that. But you mentioned redactions, and that is kind of where we're kicking off on this conversation and what brings us to why we're having this conversation here today. So Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers just signed into law back in March, Act 253, which, if I'm understanding correctly, essentially adds a hurdle to anyone who is looking to request police public records, specifically body camera and dash camera footage. Is that correct?
Yes. So this law just deals with law enforcement and corrections agencies, and it just deals with their audio and video materials. And basically it says that if you are requesting those materials from one of those agencies through a public records request, then they can charge you for the cost of redacting anything. So, for example, if you ask for body camera footage and the police need to blur out, the face of a minor or something else that might violate someone's privacy, or really whatever they deem appropriate to blur out because they have a lot of latitude when it comes to that kind of thing, then they can charge you for the time and labor of doing that. And that is a new thing in Wisconsin's open records landscape. Previously, that's something that the statutes at the state level did not authorize, and that courts at the state level said that governments couldn't do.
Okay, interesting. So this is just kind of like new for Wisconsin in general. Like it seems, at least in my experience, that Wisconsin has a pretty robust public records policy, and people are pretty able to go through and access or go through and request records. But this is different because, again, it's adding a new hurdle again for people to get access to this information, right? The whole reason that police have said that we want to have body cameras is for transparency. But does this law help with that transparency? Or like, how do we get around that? Is this law supposed to make it easier for police to be able to do their jobs in terms of getting those records out to people?
No, it's really not, because what's happening with the whole body cameras thing, and this is something that if you're not familiar with public records and open records in general, is helpful to know. At most levels of government, you have various laws, like Wisconsin's open records laws, that generally set out some pretty good parameters around what the public is allowed to access and put some limitations on like the kinds of fees and stipulations that the government can impose. But when you get down to the practical level, most government agencies only have so much staff and capacity devoted to handling those requests. So that pretty much always slows things down. Mm-hmm. And even a government agency acting in good faith might have trouble turning things around in a timely manner, especially if somebody's asking for a lot of complicated information. And I think what this highlights about the argument for body cameras is that police are asking for funding for body cameras, including all over Wisconsin, including here in Madison, and saying that this will improve transparency. But when they're making that pitch, they never seem to ask for additional staffing or resources to handle the footage when it's coming out the other side and the public is asking for it. So it's creating, thousands of hours of new video footage and then sort of feeding it into the same bottleneck. And then when people start asking for it to see this footage, the response from police is often, well, this is going to be so time consuming and so expensive, and now this is placing a burden on us. And it all seems very dissonant because in a way, this is a burden that police are actively asking for.
Right. I don't want to say they did it to themselves, but it seems like the whole process was a bit short-sighted in that way, yeah?
Charitably, it was short-sighted. Less charitably, this was a way for police departments to get more funding and get possibly another surveillance tool without really delivering on the accountability side of it. The other shortcoming with even some of the best open records laws you could find is that there's really not a whole lot of teeth to them. There really isn't a whole lot in those laws that is forcing the government to comply with them. So if somebody is standing in your way at a government agency and denying a records request for reasons that you don't feel align with the law, then basically your only recourse is to take them to court. Not everybody has the time or resources to do that. Sometimes a little public pressure can help, but that creates another hurdle. There is a lot of discretion involved, and especially when it comes to law enforcement. Anyone who has dealt with the police as a reporter can attest that different police agencies will basically take a lot of advantage of the weaknesses of public records laws. Sometimes they will just willfully misinterpret things. They'll come up with very kind of flimsily applied excuses for why they supposedly can't give you something. So there's already lots of weaknesses in here, even before we factor in this new law.
This new law being part of the news media, it can look a little shocking, right? It can make it seem like it's going to make our jobs a lot harder. But I'm very curious in your perspective as to why you think, let's say, the average CityCast Madison listener should or needs to or doesn't need to care about this law at all.
I think members of the public do need to care about things like this. And I think it's also way more important than how it impacts the news media. I mean, if you're a reporter, you are used to running into obstacles from day to day in trying to get the information you need. When it comes to filing public records requests, it's, pretty standard to be faced with some fees to some degree. So it's not even that in particular that I think we're complaining about here. And you're used to sort of getting the runaround. You're used to getting requests to clarify or narrow your request. There's a lot of back and forth that goes into it. But when it comes to releasing this sort of footage to the public, at the end of the day, the public has a right to see this footage and to understand what's going on in it. And especially when it comes to events in the news where police are pushing a certain narrative about what happened and body cameras could shed some light on that. I think that's important to everybody. I mean, you're paying for it. And I don't think that anybody really needs to see a piece of footage that could violate somebody's privacy or put someone in danger. But the vast majority of this stuff is stuff that people should be able to see and should be able to inspect, because this is the police at the end of the day are a government agency and have a fundamental right to know what they're doing.
let's get a little bit more local, right? Madison, we don't have body cams across all of MPD. And I've seen that some local officials, including 2 Madison alders, the Wisconsin Freedom of Information Council, the ACLU of Wisconsin, and even the Wisconsin State Journal editorial board have all come out against this law. They've really sort of rallied against it. But of course, that didn't stop it from going through. So what were some of their biggest concerns? And especially, on that local level, what have you heard Madison officials saying that they're concerned about with this new act?
Yeah, well, there's, a small minority of the Madison Common Council that will actually stand up to the police and meaningfully question what MPD is trying to do. One of those alders, Juliana Bennett, mentioned to me that she was concerned that this could create an equity issue with access to police records. At the local level, we have a city ordinance that would currently prohibit the Madison Police Department from taking advantage of this law. And they may or may not ask the Common Council to change that. I found in my reporting that MPD Chief Sean Barnes did at least signal an interest in that, to the Common Council.
And you mentioned Alder Juliana Bennett. What has she said specifically about this new act and what are her concerns?
Well, what she said was that this would create barriers to equity, accountability, and transparency. And, when you're adding another layer of cost to accessing a public record, that clearly creates some equity issues. I think anyone who's filed public records requests is used to dealing with fees up to a certain level, and you could debate philosophically whether that's appropriate. But there is a point where if the fees add up, that's clearly creating an issue for access. That's clearly creating a barrier to access. If you're asking people to pay a certain amount of money and not everybody out there has that amount of money to spare. I should point out that this law doesn't affect people accessing body camera footage in the context of a civil or criminal court case. But again, the broader issue is these are public records that the public has a right to check out. So there's definitely a concern about just this getting in the way of the transparency that some people have argued that body cameras might bring, and indeed in Madison, leading up to this pilot program that we have now, that was a big part of the argument for it, as it is everywhere. It was in all these different incidents, if only the officers had had body cameras, then we would be able to have a clearer picture of what happened. And critics of body cameras have also pointed out that, the footage itself isn't necessarily going to be as revealing as some people think. There are a lot of issues with that. But I guess, yeah, the concern is definitely creating those cost barriers, creating barriers to media access, but not only to media access. And I think the other overarching concerns just stem from things that are baked into this law. Mm-hmm. It creates some parameters around financial gain. And it basically says you can apply for an exemption to redaction fees if you attest that you are not planning to use the records for financial gain. And it doesn't define at all what that is supposed to mean in this context or how people are supposed to apply it. So in the current landscape, that gives police pretty broad discretion to interpret that however they want. And it says that if you falsely attest that you're not using records for financial gain, again, how that's determined, who determines it, not clear, then you could get fined $10,000. And that is extremely unusual, possibly unheard of for public records laws to create some kind of punishment that is aimed at the person requesting records. Usually the worst that could happen to you is that someone tells you no, or someone asks you to pay high fees that you don't want to pay, and you say no thank you and walk away. But this punishment aspect, I think, makes it more intimidating and threatening to request public records.
Yeah. And I think I read somewhere along the way that a lot of this law, and especially that financial gain aspect of it all, was in response to YouTubers who were requesting dash cam footage and just posting it online for views. And that's kind of how this whole thing bubbled up, right? And that is that really even a problem?
The YouTube thing was a big talking point when this was working its way through the legislature. Several of the lawmakers who were pushing this and several of the police organizations that were pushing this, not surprisingly, like every major like police union and police professional organization in the state lobbied in favor of this. Some of the legislators who worked on this bill are former police officers. One is actually a current police officer. So it's very much a bill by and for police. But getting back to the YouTube thing was that, people are asking us for all this body camera footage now. Mm-hmm. And police agencies around the state only have so much staff and so much time. So if they're going to process these records requests, then it's going to create a lot of expense for them. And especially if you have to go through and redact things, and that's going to add up and so on and so forth. And I don't know if anybody ever really quantified this complaint about YouTubers taking police camera footage and putting it on YouTube to make easy ad money. But there were some generalized claims that this creates a scenario where a records custodian or what have you at a police department is basically invited to look into who you are and what you might be doing with this video to assess whether you might make financial gain from it. I mean, that is wildly inappropriate and just weird, frankly.
So then is this whole thing just a big step backward in the fight for transparency?
I think it's definitely a big obstacle, and it really cuts against the spirit and in some cases the letter of the rest of the open records laws around it in the state. Yeah, I mean, I do think it's an obstruction. And I think, too, the fact that there isn't a lot of clarity about what it means. There has been no guidance from the State Department of Justice, which usually doles out some guidance on open records laws. That just creates so much potential for abuse and, at the very least, for lots of confusion and delays as people sort through what this means, which in and of itself is also going to obstruct access to these records.
Yeah, it feels like a hard square to circle, right? Because these records, it is hours and hours long worth of footage, and there are only so many people in a department. I think I read in your reporting that UWPD, which has been using body cameras for the last 9 years, they have a staff of 2 people that are responsible for records requests, and they responded to more than 777 requests in 2022, which is a lot, right? So I understand that they would want to recoup some of the money in on their lost on that time and on that effort. But also, again, is that not just their job?
Yeah, it is their job. And the answer should be for state governments, local governments, federal government to provide more money and more staffing. And frankly, I think in a lot of cases, if police were going to legislatures and city councils and so forth and asking for that, they would have a pretty good chance of getting it, given elected officials are by and large pushovers for the police. So, if our common council was willing to fund a whole body camera pilot program and possibly expand that citywide, then why wouldn't they be willing to consider adding some staff positions or capacity or other resources that might make it easier to process this? It just doesn't add up to say, give us this funding for body cameras, it'll produce transparency, and then not prepare yourself for the implications of having all of that footage that could potentially be subject to public records requests. I mean, the fact that UWPD has had body cameras this long and still has pretty limited staff capacity for handling it, you look at that and the disconnect there and you go, at what point is that a choice?
Right.
And not just some tough spot that police have been put into by whatever journalists and evil YouTubers.
Are we going to learn a lesson from this? Are we learning the lesson from this right now? Or do we see this type of legislation becoming a trend? I'm curious to know what you think the future holds when it comes to the future of Wisconsin's public records.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, around the country, well before this, there was already a lot of trouble accessing body camera footage from police and a lot of different state and local governments that created different kinds of barriers to access. So this has been an ongoing problem for a while, this disconnect, between the arguments for body cameras and then the difficulty of accessing the footage once police have body cameras. And when you look at this law, like just reading it as just like a basic piece of text, it is very unclear how to apply and interpret some of it. So there's going to have to be a point where the State Department of Justice or the courts step in and provide some kind of clarity. Personally, I don't think this law should have been passed and signed in the first place. It's like the people who wrote the law didn't really think through what they were actually trying to do all that clearly. And all these police organizations lobbied for it without really seeming to think about how it would apply in a practical way. So, Wisconsin has a full-time legislature. State legislators here have resources to help them sort out what they're trying to do and help them word legislation in a way that gets the effect that they want. So there just really isn't an excuse for putting a law on the books like this that is so completely vague and just poorly crafted. Just like on a basic level, whether you agree with the substance of it or not, I think it's pretty hard to argue that, that the legislators who wrote this and then passed it and then the governor who signed it were like doing their jobs all that well, frankly. So I don't know what it means. And the uncertainty it creates and the clear departures that it creates from our open records laws and from case law around open records, it does create a lot of uncertainty.
So it sounds like we will be watching this story unfold in the future, whether it is on tonemadison.com or in our state court system. But I know you're going to be working on more of this story. How can people keep up with Tone Madison and follow your work? Yeah,
we're at tonemadison.com. And if you go to tonemadison.com/newsletter, you can sign up for our email newsletters, which is a really good and easy way to keep up. And we're also on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Sounds like you got your work cut out for you, Scott. But thanks so much for taking the time to talk about it all with us today. Scott Gordon, Tone Madison. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hayley.
That's Scott Gordon, publisher of Tone Madison, talking with CityCast Madison's executive producer, Hayley Sperling. If you want to read Scott's Tone Madison piece on this topic, head to our show notes for a link. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone who keeps it real with you, free of charge? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care.